Mama tried to raise me better, but her fleeting eye denied that leaves only me to blame, 'cause Mama tried.
Hey, you know what was a cool movie? The 1978 Halloween, and for obvious reasons, but one interesting aspect of that movie that I always found the most frightening was a sort of logical through line in which the film presented many of its iconic scenes. You know why a scene like this is particularly creepy? It's not just for the fact that he disappears, but rather it's a believable disappearance, as in, it's not too far-fetched to see how he could have just exited in a number of ways, and this movie is full of moments just like that. It raises a number of questions, such as, is this an actual supernatural entity we're dealing with, or is it just some really sneaky guy? Is it both? These questions, if you haven't gathered from my other videos, are what I find to be some of the most enjoyable parts of any work of horror. Now, in this particular instance, Michael Myers is a supernatural entity of sorts, but in the beginning we're not so sure. Though it is possible for a movie to present these types of scares and unnerving elements and then bring it all back to reality to create a logical and believable reason for how it all adds up, and when done correctly, it can be an incredibly unique and frightening experience. I call this the illusion of the supernatural. Now, if Halloween is the first example of this, for argument's sake, we'll say it pioneered this idea, which was then refined and revitalized by Wes Craven's Scream in 1996, and finally punctuated by The Strangers in 2008, which will be the main focus of this video. But we'll look at more examples as we go on and take a brief look at how all this came to be. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a different format. We're going to be talking about The Strangers, and instead of just focusing on what it does right and what it does wrong, we're also going to take a look at some scenes in particular detail and analyze how some of them work in a relatively realistic way, adding to the overall efficacy of the elements of horror that are present. But before we do all that, I need to give you an idea of where this is all coming from. The title suggests that we're dealing with more than just this film, and that's true. So let me first start with a personal story. Again, for those of you not interested, or for anyone who wants to just jump ahead to any sections of the content, check the displayed screen now for a timestamp, and remember these timestamps will always be provided in the description. For everyone else, let's get started. So in 2008, when The Strangers first came out in theaters, I was immediately turned off by the marketing. This is a common grievance I have when it comes to how horror movies are advertised. It's like, they always show you the majority of the jump scares, and more often than not end up showing you major plot points of the film. I mean, I understand it would be hard to market a horror movie by specifically focusing on just downtime and atmosphere, you know, the parts of the movie we usually, as fans of the genre, tend to actually enjoy, but whatever. So I see some more trailers and decide there's nothing even remotely interesting looking about this movie, and I just write it off. Well, maybe a couple months after the movie came out, I finally got around to seeing it through the interwebs and all that, and I was conflicted, to say the least. So I discussed the matter with a friend of mine, and by discussed, I mean I ranted about parts of the movie that particularly annoyed me. One thing you should know about me, and all of my friends can attest, is I rant a lot, and sometimes I don't let things go easily. Like sometimes for days. Or years. Look, I'm still complaining about certain movies or games that rubbed me the wrong way, sometimes a decade later. Anyway, my buddy kept listening to me drone on and on about this movie, until eventually, after about 2 weeks of my incessant whining, he just calmly asks, okay, so what didn't you like about this movie? And I remember just standing there thinking, like, the hell are you talking about? And he just goes, it just seems like you're mad that this movie was good. And then it hit me. I actually liked this movie. A lot. And I was annoyed because they were successfully implementing ideas that I had come up with for a kind of book that I was writing at the time, which I never did finish, but suffice to say it shared a lot of common elements and little details. Okay, so how does this all come together? Genre defining can be really weird and downright confusing. While it's not the most complicated thing in the world, oftentimes there's a lot of gray area of overlap, especially for the layman like myself. What I mean by that is when you look up The Strangers, it'll tell you that it's a slasher film, but others say it's an example of a home invasion film. Now, most people know what a slasher film is. It's a subgenre of horror that is defined by a psychopathic killer pursuing and murdering a series of victims, oftentimes in visceral detail. Slasher films actually go back quite a bit, but for the sake of brevity, a lot of critical consensus would list the 1960s Psycho as not so much the first movie to do it, but the most influential and most well-executed at introducing a refined example to the public. Yeah, I know, there's inevitably going to be someone out there who's like, "Nuh-uh, bro, this one example of some random independent movie that no one has ever heard of was the first. Lol, shows how dumb you are, yeah, whatever, see you in the comments, jackass." Anyway, home invasion is not so much a genre, but rather a theme oftentimes presented in horror and can be be portrayed in other genres, like thrillers, for example. But for the sake of clarity and ease of discussion, we're going to call it its own genre in this video, and its definition is pretty self-explanatory. Any film which depicts a forced entry into a character's place of dwelling as a major plot point. Interestingly enough, the first home invasion film was actually The Lonely Villa in 1909, which depicted a group of criminals breaking into a wealthy family's home while the father is out, and they proceed to assault and terrorize the wife and daughters left behind. Some things never change. The two genres are not mutually exclusive. In fact, when put together, they can create a powerful symbiotic narrative relationship, if done correctly. See, having a killer chase someone around their home isn't anything too groundbreaking. But when an air of supernatural elements are implied, well, then it gets interesting. Like I said earlier, it opens our minds to interpretation, and it strengthens the horror that's already present, in that something even more frightening could be lurking beneath the already frightening premise. Hence the illusion of the supernatural. So to summarize this entire video in one sentence, the strangers go from seeming like ghost people to slowly becoming real people to actually being revealed to just be people. No spoops, just crazy people. So what we'll do now is look at a concise timeline of some films along with the ones I've already touched upon, demonstrating the aforementioned effect. And I stress that this is a short list of movies which are tangentially related to both the topics of slashers, home invasions, and how it's kind of all progressed throughout the years. The Lonely Villa, 1909. This is the first home invasion film, easily accessible on YouTube or anywhere else, and it's just 10 minutes long, so you really got nothing to lose. Check it out and you can see how a lot of ideas are still being used to this day. Halloween, 1978. What more can I say about this movie that hasn't already been said a million times? Go fucking watch it if you haven't seen it. When a Stranger Calls, 1979, oftentimes cited to be the most frightening introduction in horror cinema history, which depicts a terrifying premise with some terrifying implications. Just in the beginning, though. This one was based off an old urban legend that you probably have heard in some form or another.
Leave me alone!
Jill, this is Sergeant Sacker. Listen to me. We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. Our squad car's on the way over there right now.
Scream in 1996. So wait, what happened throughout the entire 1980s? Why didn't any of the classic horror icons make it on this list? Well, because like I said, we're trying to focus primarily on movies without the literal supernatural influence. Also, pretty much the entire reason Scream was so successful was because it subverted so many tropes that were prevalent in horror up to that point. The classic figures like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees became characters we came to know and love. Emphasis on love. They unfortunately lost their edge, pun absolutely intended. Say what you will about Scream, whether you loved it or hated it, the cultural impact cannot be denied. It didn't just revitalize the horror genre and spread it to an entirely new and wider audience, but it also reset the standards that many movies would abide by for years to come. And like I said, logically the supernatural elements and the spooky effects, which are in the movie, like this. So you can see Ghostface in the background there, and he's, oh, hold on, she's calling 911. She's calling 911, he's still in the background there, and then she looks away for 9 seconds, and, where'd he go? Whoa, how'd he do that? It's all explained. It's because there's two killers, which suddenly brings it all together in the end. Like I said, logical conclusion when the whole time we were suspecting it could be something much more. There's our illusion again.
Surprise, Sydney.
Now, was this a perfect representation of this idea? No, because it clearly had its flaws in many ways. But, like we've been talking about, this was a refined example of the idea that Halloween presented, and this idea set in motion tons of other movies which would try to capitalize on the rekindled interest in the slasher movie genre. Trash like Urban Legend and I Know What You Did Last Summer. Ugh. 2006 came along and we got the French-Romanian film Them, which was about a couple in a remote home being tormented by seemingly supernatural events. This movie actually did quite a bit right with the movement of the intruders and the odd noises they would produce, leading us to believe they must be some kind of spirits or creatures. Good idea, but ultimately fell flat at the end with a ridiculous conclusion. This movie is oftentimes cited as potential inspiration for The Strangers. Then we get what I consider to be the pinnacle of the weird genre blending we've been discussing, The Strangers in 2008. This one was the game changer. Even Cabin in the Woods with its ridiculous monster mash at the end paid homage to this movie with what they call The Family. I feel like too many movies in the years to come would take away all the wrong messages and ideas from The Strangers, but of course, we'll be going way more in depth on that when we get to the actual critique. You're Next, 2011. If you haven't seen You're Next, definitely give it a watch, as it's interesting enough in that it tries to subvert the tropes of home invasion and adds an entertaining layer of black comedy. Entertaining, yes, but utterly lacking on any real scares. I think it was this attempted subversion that acted as kind of a heads up that the genre was in need of repair. Things were starting to get stale.
Really? You had to do that right in front of me?
Were you saying something?
2013 gave us The Purge, and I consider this movie to be the absolute epitome of trying too hard. Too many mask-wearing figures tilting their heads and trying to unnerve the audience. It's also a failed political allegory that literally adds nothing to the genre. Actually, having wrote this, I would say go watch this movie just to see what it is that you shouldn't do. Granted, there was some cool action, but that doesn't mean there were any good scares, and the movie was trying to be scary. And I will admit, I did enjoy the sequel, but that's not saying much. And that brings us to 2016's Hush, a movie about a deaf woman trapped in the usual masked killer scenario. It's an interesting enough premise, but it really doesn't do anything we haven't seen before, and unlike The Purge, this movie utilizes tropes in a very vanilla and safe way, demonstrating how the genre can still be entertaining so long as you have decent writing. Entertaining, yes, but no scares whatsoever. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this movie to anyone. And then 2018 would bring us The Strangers, Prey at Night, and boy is this movie trash. Now, the only reason I'm slamming it so hard is because it fails incredibly at delivering the same level of creepiness and suspense as the first, and also falls victim to many contemporary design trends that are not good. It's one thing to use tropes somewhat safely and tastefully, like I just mentioned Hush kinda did, but it's another to try and appeal to a wider audience and lose your identity in the process. We'll talk more on this later, but man, this movie sucked. So having all that out of the way, let's now take an in-depth look at The Strangers and see just how it does in both terms of filmmaking and its use of horror. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, let's go through the entire thing right now. Last chance to abort before I spoil the entire plot in detail. The movie opens with a dramatic display of information telling us that this was all based on true events, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. On the one hand, it's important to understand how Hollywood can use this idea to somewhat deceive a lot of people. By simply stating based on a true story, you can do whatever you want and add as many exaggerated details as you want because you're not technically lying about there being source material. Always keep that in mind when you see based on a true story or based on true events, which is even more vague, because that just literally means you can mash a bunch of stories together and say, yeah, see, events happened, see? On the other hand, saying based on a true story just makes shit scarier for normies. But this film does draw its primary inspiration from the murders that the Manson family committed in 1969, which will come up here again, as there are multiple references to it and a lot of symbolism that's relevant. Anyway, the narration tells us that a terrible crime has been committed and the details are still unknown. Note the text is even in that burnt orange color, which was popular during the 1970s, already symbolic of the time frame I just mentioned. We're then shown a brief montage of homes passing by as viewed from a vehicle, and the space between homes gets further and further while the daylight begins to dwindle, emphasizing just how remote we're starting to get here. Now, it's interesting to note that a total of 8 homes were shown passing, 8 being a reverent number in many religions representing infinity and cycles, which the movie definitely uses as a motif, and it's a reference to the night of August 8th, 1969, which was when the Tate murders had occurred. So right off the bat, we're witnessing some heavy symbolism. I also want to point out that this seems to be from the perspective of the strangers themselves, as implied from the vintage truck engine sounds, letting us know that they're on the hunt per se. The next scene depicts 2 boys entering a scene of absolute chaos, with a slow panning shot into some excellent framing which displays the 2 boys through the broken glass of a car's windshield. This immediately demonstrates the juxtaposition between their innocence and what they have just encountered. And it's no coincidence that they're church types, which we technically won't find out till later, but the fact that they're wearing white, clean shirts and dressed formally is indicative of this anyway. This whole time we're hearing a 911 call between one of the boys and a dispatcher, which attempts to immediately set the stakes and deliver tension, although I feel like this scene could have actually been better without it. Instead, it could have been told entirely in silence, with just the ambient nature noises that typically prevail the rest of the movie, but this was okay enough, I guess. You gotta keep the audience interested. Another interesting little detail that will be relevant later is how the boys, upon approaching the doorway, hesitate to enter, and there's a harsh contrast between the outside light and the darkness inside the home, symbolically reinforcing how they're at the threshold of darkness, or again, chaos. A series of close-up shots on items keeps the scene visually moving and are reminiscent of crime scene photography, and the items in particular would lead the audience to believe it could have been a number of things, from a burglary gone wrong to a horrendous domestic dispute. We're then introduced to our main characters, Kristen McKay, played by Liv Tyler,
May it be an evening star, shine
and James Hoyt, played by a Scott Speedman. The two are shown waiting at a traffic light and are depicted in quite an emotional state. This is an interesting use of lighting because the two are illuminated by the red light, which red is symbolic of passion and love while also representing violence and anger. Also, it's interesting to note that the red also means, in this literal instance, stop, which represents how the couple has hit a roadblock and their progress in life has been halted. And on the flip side of that same literal interpretation, the light also acts as a warning, telling them to go no further, for if they do, danger lies ahead. The light then shifts to green, and there's a moment of hesitation before they continue on. Green represents the color of life and growth, but to live life means taking risks and potential trouble. Lighting in this movie, for the most part, is done interestingly enough in that the whole thing is a warm and vibrant tone. Cozy incandescent lighting creates a comfortable setting, which is a wonderful clash against the horrific events that the movie then gets into. And even in the scenes outdoors, the streetlights and lamps add to this warm orange-gold hue over everything. Once again, that 70s orange is represented. I also want to note that dark or burnt orange can oftentimes represent deceit and is associated with autumn, which also represents change and letting go of the past, which is important as a motif this film explores. So the couple makes it out to the summer home, and a lot of calming night shots really tell us how far out in the wilderness they are. Upon reaching the doorway, again notice how Kristen is hesitant at the threshold, and once again we're shown a sharp contrast between the outside lighting and the pure darkness that is beyond. Yes, I understand she's smoking a cigarette, so that's literally why she isn't entering right away, but I think the movie is a little smarter than that, and instead of simply reusing the same symbol, they subtly recreate it. Scott walks right in because at that point he feels he has nothing to lose. Again, there's a lot of very harsh contrasts between light and dark in the lighting of these scenes. The warm lighting of the country home is constantly offset by the heavy looming shadows with some very nice framing choices to add to the effect. We're shown red flower petals scattered about the home, and this acts as a foreshadowing for the copious amounts of blood that will be shed in the near future. Even the rust in the water of the bathtub contributes to this. James calls his friend and asks to be picked up, and we're given a brief flashback of the events that occurred earlier in the evening, showing us that the couple had a very passionate and seemingly alright relationship until James proposed to Kristen and was turned down for reasons that we can only speculate. I want to point out that there's some pretty great acting going on with a lot of the non-verbal actions of the characters. It really does feel as if we're that awkward third party in the middle of their relationship's tension. It's interesting to me because I know this exact feeling of sadness, disappointment, or overall worthlessness that is being conveyed by James in this scene. At the same time, I can also relate to the pervasive thoughts and insecurity being conveyed by Kristen in her somber yet reflective state. Now, is this top-notch, Oscar-worthy acting? I'm just making the case for how little details can go a long way. And it's also interesting to note how both characters are trapped in their own heads, emotionally racked by negative thoughts, which is also going to manifest literally and symbolically. An interesting filming technique a lot of these movies use, that is home invasion movies I mean, is they'll have this distinct camera wobble, which is just a little intentionally unstable. Now this isn't just to create tension and remind us that we should probably be a little uncomfortable, but it also acts as a sort of creepy suggestion that a third party is watching. The first time I really noticed this was with the movie Them. If you take a look at this scene in particular, you'll get what I'm talking about. They could easily have just used a normal stationary shot, which would have been fine and aesthetically pleasing in and of itself, but like I said, this further emphasizes the creepy factor without being overly dramatic. At certain times throughout this movie, though, and others, I think it's a little overdone. Like in certain areas, it's just kind of like, okay, camera guy, come on, hold the damn thing straight. And for a moment, we see the couple's passion rekindled. We hear a soothing soundtrack and see how their problems seem to fade away, as if hope is being restored, only to be interrupted by this shit.
Does it come in threes?
Yeah?
Stops at dawn?
Uh-huh.
Well, sometimes it's meant as an insult to the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
There's a cool little detail here with the reveal of Dollface. You only see a figure shrouded in darkness, but note how you can actually see some orange light reflecting off of her eyes, giving the same effect as if seeing eye shine from an animal in the woods at night, a direct implication of the predator-prey relationship the movie is setting up. I gotta say, I just love this interaction, and let's talk why it's effective in and of itself in terms of horror. It's downright bad enough getting a knock on the door in the middle of the night. What's even worse would be getting a knock on your door in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, and what's even creepier is the downright eerie interaction that goes down. The girl seems dazed almost, and the whole conversation feels like an odd fever dream rather than a normal interaction.
Is Tamara here?
No. No, you got the wrong house.
You sure?
This is emphasized by the "are you sure" line and the uncomfortably long pauses in between her words. Basically, it implies that you're not speaking to a human, rather, you're speaking to something that's trying to act human, but doesn't quite understand how, aka a psychopath. Or is it something more? And this is exactly where everything starts to go downhill, and as if the creepy interaction wasn't weird enough, she just walks off into the dark woods afterwards. The couple then discusses some more about their relationship and how their plans are changing, and James goes off to get Kristen some cigarettes. Before he does, though, he builds her a fire, and this is also symbolic of the predator-prey motif and harkens back to early man, as one member of the party must venture into the night and warns the other to stay by the fire to keep them safe. This is even emphasized by Kristen huddling up next to it in the next scene here. We then are alone with Kristen as she wanders about the home. I think the record player here is not just an homage to the time period in which the movie draws inspiration, but also a representation of the cyclical nature of violence, as mentioned in the beginning with the FBI statistics. Anyway, we get a slightly humorous moment where she tries the wedding ring on, but can't take it back off. Also, the soundtrack here asking the question, should we go outside, is a nice touch. We then hear the knocking once more, only way more intense, and we get yet another creepy encounter through the door, asking again for a Tamara. By the way, that was a very popular girl's name during the 1970s, again a time period reference. Oof, the "are you sure" gets me every time.
You already came by here. Are you sure?
The girl leaves and we're once again left with just Kristen, who tends to the fire, which is getting smoke everywhere, causing the fire alarm to go off. A great shot happens here when we hear the knocking yet again, and you can see a slow motion moment which brilliantly captures that spike of adrenaline in the moment of fight or flight response. If you've ever been really scared by a real world threat, you know exactly what this feeling is like. Everything just freezes up. Excellent idea, technique-wise. She then tries to use her cell phone, it doesn't work, then she gets changed out of her dress, which is important, the dress I mean, but we'll talk about that later. We're also constantly shown the smoke detector on the floors, which will have a payoff in the upcoming scene. She calls James from the landline, but the phone cuts out, because of course it does. The tension here is pretty well done for the most part, but it starts to get a little drawn out pacing-wise, which overall I'd say is one of the movie's biggest problems. It feels slightly too long, but I'll talk more about those points when they arise. So next we get a great shot, which introduces the man in the mask in a wonderfully subtle and creepy way, and the framing here is excellent, as it shows Kristen standing directly underneath the mounted deer, once again representing our predator-prey aspect. This scene is so damn good because it demonstrates just how easily the guy was able to walk in and be sneaky about it, no less. Not to mention the contrast between the pitch black entryway and the off-white mask makes it appear like a ghostly figure just hovering there. A creepy and well executed idea. A ton of movies should have made note of this, but unfortunately they seem to have missed it entirely, as demonstrated by the movie Hush in 2016.
I can come in anytime I want. And I can get you anytime I want.
Kristen then hears the door shut, which is awesome because this whole thing is letting atmosphere do the talking. The man in the mask didn't attack her, he didn't pop out, he just appeared then fucking walks out the door like what the fuck is that about? She goes over to investigate and we see the smoke detector placed on the chair. See, this was a great idea but a little forced. We were shown the smoke detector on the ground twice beforehand, and the second shot was really extended just to make sure you got it. I think just demonstrating it through the first one would have been fine enough because you're relying on the intelligence of the audience to get what happened. I also think this scene overall would have been better if done before we saw the man in the mask appear. What I mean is that if she had seen the smoke detector placed on the chair beforehand, that would have implied to the audience and the character that something really spooky was going on, aka the illusion of the supernatural. But the impact of this scene is lessened because we already know it was just the dude in the background, so it wasn't as strong as it could have been. Like, we see the character get scared, but we could have been scared together. Still a great sequence, still some good creepiness, but could have been done better overall. Then we get our first real scene of shit going down with the full reveal of the man in the mask. I want to first point out that this movie's sound design is overall pretty good, but I think this record player scene knocks it out of the park, with a broken loop creating what sounds like a distorted children's song, which suits the movie well because there is a fucked up sense of playfulness going on. So props for that. I really thought that was well done. The front door then opens and we get our first look at Dollface, who peeks right back at us. I want to take this moment to note that while the sound design is alright, I'd say another huge weakness of this movie is its over-reliance on heavy stingers. While they're not always present when the strangers are around, the moments with them would be just as frightening, if not more so, without the stinger noise. This is evidenced by any of these scenes where the killers are on screen and you don't hear anything. Their presence and image alone is enough to create the spookiness. There's also a problem with just how loud it gets. See, when the stinger is happening, usually that means Kristen is also screaming at the top of her lungs, making for one of those viewing experiences where you're constantly turning the volume up and down, which can be really annoying for someone like me because I like to watch movies while wearing headphones for full immersion. Kristen runs off into the bedroom and cuts her hand when she accidentally breaks a lamp. We hear the front door open, the record player stop, and the tension is through the roof. Luckily for us, it's James, who has returned seemingly empty-handed. I had heard some people complain about this scene because they asked, how did the strangers suddenly disappear? Well, I mean, it seems like a long driveway in the middle of nowhere at night, and he was in a car, so it makes sense that the strangers could have seen him coming with the headlights and all that, and the sound of a vehicle pulling in, and they just went and hid. Anyway, then we get that scene. You know, the scene where James reassures Kristen that everything is fine and they search the whole house to find nothing at all. Okay, for real though, who keeps their shower curtains closed? You're just asking to have someone or something hiding in there. After clearing the whole house, we're given a great moment where the couple looks out a window. We're shown Dollface just standing in the open, and even the characters have sort of a self-referential moment when James says both, she looks like a ghost, and acknowledges that people don't just stand there like that.
They don't want to talk.
When they want something, people just don't stand up there staring at us like that. They want something.
As I've covered in several videos thus far, these types of self-referential moments are wonderful because when done correctly, we as the audience are unnerved a bit. The logic being that if the characters themselves are able to deduce that something out of a horror movie must be happening, then they demonstrate that they're smarter than we suspected. And as such, that means the movie has to do something very intelligent to subvert what we, the audience, and the characters think is going to happen next. Which, in this instance, Dollface just disappears. But let's take a closer look at how this scene works so well. By the way, I just love the imagery here. It's so creepy.
She looks like a ghost.
First, the scene is once again completely saturated in an orange glow, representing caution or potential danger. This is demonstrated by the fact that there's no real action being taken. The characters are simply witnessing something hazardous through a superficial barrier, no less. The point of her standing in the open like this has multiple uses, some of which can simultaneously be accomplished. For instance, by standing here, she could simply be acting as an imposing figure, as in she's literally just trying to creep them out. She could also be standing there as a means of distraction, allowing for any accomplices to do what they need to do whilst drawing attention to herself. Note also she's standing quite a distance away to mitigate any potential retaliation, meaning if you ran out after her, she'd have plenty of space as a head start on getting away. She could also be there as a means of surveying the layout of the home or just getting an idea of the surroundings. Finally, it's worth noting that by blatantly appearing in the open, it's a direct challenge to whomever you may be stalking. It's kind of like, here I am, what are you gonna do about it? Much in the same way you shout, ready or not, here I come.
It's not from the front, but from the side. From the other two raptors, you didn't even know were there.
So the next part of this scene is how she disappears, because I've heard many people voice their concerns in this area. What we're failing to take into account is how our main characters look away for a good 8 to 9 seconds. Now let's look at the framing here. Logically speaking, she could easily just dart to the left, and the movie makes a point of letting us know that she can run around fairly quickly, because in the following scene we'll be shown this. And by that same token, she could easily have just ran to the right. 8 to 9 seconds is a pretty decent window to try and hide. But more to the point, this creates that illusion of the supernatural. Clearly she's just some chick in a mask, but we're shown moments like this where it creates some form of doubt. I wager this scene would have still been effective and creepy if she had just walked off slowly while still in view, and that would have had quite an impact on the audience and the main characters. But this vanishing act is better, and it's better because it's believable.
She's gone.
Moving on, James walks outside to check the area and is drawn over to the car, which has been busted up pretty bad with the tires slashed and the windshield broken. Which brings us to this next scene, which depicts some more of this illusion effect, which people again have a hard time understanding, so let's look at it in some detail. We see James rummaging through the vehicle when he's tapped on the back from off screen. This makes sense as to why you could do this and get away with it, because he's obviously in a tight spot and can't react as quickly as demonstrated in the scene itself. We then get confirmation of what I was saying before about Dollface, with her being quick on her feet and all that, as we hear her footsteps running off from the vehicle. Now, a lot of people are like, How did she just disappear then reappear? Well, she didn't. Note how when James gets out of the car, there's a good 15 seconds where he doesn't look in the direction the footsteps ran off to. If you were paying attention, we the audience can tell by the sound design, which works well to convey which direction things are coming from or where they're going while still being a bit vague for the characters in the film. Of course, once he realizes she's standing right there, you can even see the distance isn't that far, so it's not like she suddenly teleported a mile away, although I will admit there does seem to be a bit of an incongruity with the distance in some of these shots, but that just might be me. Anyway, various noises distract him, and once again he looks away from Dollface for around 17 seconds, and of course, she's gone when he turns back. Again, 17 seconds is more than enough time to dip into the tree line, which is blatantly to her right. Plus, there's all the noise being caused by the other two, which is disorienting in and of itself. We also have to address again what the purpose of this behavior could actually be. At this point, it's safe to assume that they're just testing James to see if he is all bark and no bite. It makes sense for Dollface to do this because it would just appear to be a girl running around who may not be too capable of defending herself. And keep in mind, James hasn't actually seen the man in the mask at this point, but he seems to get the hint he's being surrounded in case he did make a move. After the encounter, James wanders around and checks the yard while hearing faint noises, demonstrating he's on edge, while also still suggesting to him and the audience that there may be something more creepy occurring than we think. Remember, this illusion is still in effect at this point. And what horror movie would be complete without the obligatory cat scare? You know, the fake-out jump scare where something totally harmless happens and there's a stinger anyway? So the two sit down and we get some exposition on how remote they are, and it's just us versus them. There's an interesting aspect here, though, in that Kristen asks what the motivation is, searching for some kind of reason for the madness, but James quickly dissuades her from asking these questions, because it doesn't really matter. They're already locked into whatever scenario is unfolding.
What would be your motive?
It's the millennium. Motives are incidental.
Which is a subtle way of implying that something beyond explanation could be occurring. Ooh. I also want to mention there's some good sound design going on here, with the background music having that weird playful tone, which only strengthens the tension built thus far.
Eerie. Really eerie.
James sees that his cell phone battery was taken, and the two make a break for the car, and there's some great work with the soundtrack going on here, really delivering the escape scene vibes. The two hop in the car and are suddenly blocked in by an old pickup truck where we're introduced to the pinup girl, who proceeds to ram the shit out of their vehicle. I always kind of wondered about this scene, like, that can't be comfortable from the driver's seat of the truck, like purposely ramming into something? I've been in plenty of low-speed car accidents, and that shit throttles your neck, so I don't know how she's just going at the car like that, but whatever, it makes for a cool scene. The couple runs back inside, grabs a shotgun that was stashed away, and they enter the bedroom to find a bunch of writing on the window. Honestly, this scene kind of falls flat for me because we've clearly been shown that the strangers have been capable of entering the home like 10 different times now, so really the fact that there's some more evidence of this and the characters react the way they do is kind of silly, because it's like you knew they were coming in and messing with shit, like taking the phone battery and moving the smoke detector. I guess you'd think they'd be kind of used to it by now, but I don't know. Another jump scare happens and the two duck into the closet and search for ammunition for the shotgun. We get some really good dialogue here, which humanizes the characters even more by demonstrating that during the courting phases, or even over the course of relationships, sometimes we dudes just make shit up to sound cool. It also demonstrates the feeling of helplessness when thrust into a life or death situation.
But you said you used to hunt with your dad.
No, I never did. It was something I said.
See, I like guns, so I encourage people to have at least some bare-bones knowledge of how to operate a firearm. God forbid you'd ever need to, but moments like this, albeit fictional, depict a very real situation, which is the I've got a gun, but I don't know how to use it, making you a danger to yourself and others in addition to the already existing threat. Point is, this scene demonstrates a challenge to James's masculinity, but the problem is resolved when the two work together. James assembles the weapon and Kristen ends up loading it for him in the next scene, conveying that by working together, the two are stronger. Relationship metaphors and stuff. Anyway, we get the next scene, which is fucking awesome. The two are about to venture outside again when suddenly an axe comes through the door. I feel like every axe through the door scene in a movie is by default just a reference to The Shining now. This scene is excellent, by the way. The sound of the chopping is super heavy sounding, and the chaos of items and splinters being thrown everywhere make for some great tension. Listen to the axe hit the piano here. Ooh, so good. The tension keeps building with the soundtrack rising until there's a brief moment, locked, loaded, and then BAM! Shotgun blast. And then it's quiet. The two hole up in a corner and lie in wait while we hear someone walking around the house. Once again, a great use of sound with the heavy-ass footsteps implying it must be a big dude, adding yet another scary detail to the man in the mask. Merle Haggard gets put on, which is ballsy as fuck. Like, from the killer's perspective, if you know the person in the house has a gun, and you know they're hiding with it somewhere, putting on loud-ass music is so goddamn risky. It's like, you better be damn sure of your hunting and stealth skills if you're gonna basically level the playing field for both of you guys. Like, I would want to hear as much as I can, but I get the logic in that you gotta cover your own noise, but also, geez, why take the risk? But then again, I'm not insane. Well, not in the... Anyway, moving on. James's friend shows up, who we called in the beginning, gets spooked, goes inside, and dies. But not in the way we would have thought. This is a great example of subversion in that you see the dude walk in, you see Dollface watching him from the shadows, he then makes his way down the hallway, and the man in the mask is trailing him, again, ninja-like. But nope, he ends up walking into the couple's line of sight, and boom, a very graphic scene, and the couple's reactions are wonderfully delivered. Some very good acting going on here as the two demonstrate the events have nearly broken them. And of course, right afterwards, they decide to split up, pretty much ensuring they're gonna get fucked. They're gonna go try to call for help via a radio in the barn out back. We also get this really great moment of psychological torture. I really thought this was well delivered. So James goes outside, gets spotted by the pinup girl, and blindsided by the man in the mask. This creates a through line for the scenes to come. The whole movie established there's a barn out back through some shots in particular. It shows pinup lurking around that area, whereas the man in the mask just took out James and is doubled back to the house. It shows him walking in looking for Kristen. Also, heavy breathing through his mask. Totally not a Halloween reference, or it could just be he was running around being active. Kristen makes a break for the barn, trips and falls, and continues crawling on all fours, with the soundtrack escalating, literally driving the predator-prey relationship even further with her scurrying through the trees. Pinup appears behind her. Once again, people said, where did she come from? Well, it just showed her lingering out there, so it makes sense in that regard, but how did she disappear? Well, once again, there's a good 8 seconds that occurs after Kristen realizes she's being followed and turns around, leaving plenty of time for Pinup to have ducked behind any one of these trees. This next scene, I'll just go ahead and say it. I don't really care much for it. It just kind of feels tacked on in order to get Pinup some more screen time, which is fine. And yeah, I guess it shows the radio being destroyed to really signify how screwed they are, but I really think it could have been shorter because it's just a lot of what we've already been witnessing, so I've got nothing else to really say about it. Kristen makes her way back to the house, and there's a few good things happening here. First, she spots the man in the mask sneaking around, which is interesting because it subtly shows they're human after all, and can be snuck up on should the characters have the ability to do so, reining in our illusion and slowly wearing it off rather than outright abruptly changing the atmosphere or turning the tables. But this moment of silence is broken by the appearance of Pinup in the well-known scene of Dollface on the swing set. I think the swing set is a little heavy-handed on the whole playful aspect, when other things I've mentioned earlier hinted at that better. Soundtrack is hella dramatic, and this whole sequence really is great at summarizing what the film has been all about. The car is engulfed in flames, the main character is injured and crawling around, and the strangers are there 1 minute, then gone the next. Once back inside, the lights go out and Kristen is in the dark. Interesting choice of lighting because once again we're saturated in that orange glow, only this time it's from the fire, which normally would be such a comforting feeling, but we know the fire can't protect us, so this raises the fear factor. Kristen barely evades the man in the mask, who can also play a descending C major scale, and once again we're being shown our illusion of the supernatural wearing thin. There's no more questions or suggestions about it now. We're being shown that these are just people. It's a nice touch how he just walks past her though, because it leaves us wondering as to whether or not he actually saw her. Either way, it works. On the one hand, if he did miss her, it's still a terrifying moment because all he would need to do is look her direction and it'd be over. On the other hand, he could just be fucking with her and pretending to not have noticed, which is terrifying in and of itself because again it displays the cat and mouse style of pursuit that's going on here. Which brings us to yet another scene that many are confused by. Okay, so Kristen hides in the pantry after the close encounter and she witnesses the man in the mask walking around and he glances directly at where she's hiding. Many concerns were voiced about this, like, How could he have known she was in there? Like, why did he look directly at her? Well, let's look at the scene closely. First, we don't know what he's actually looking at because his eyes are hidden, and just because he's facing the door doesn't mean he's glancing right at her. But it's a neat effect because it's ambiguous and it adds to the tension. Then he sits down for a moment, gets back up, glances over Kristen's direction one more time, and then leaves. So again, we don't know what he's looking at here, but if I were to guess, he's either glancing around searching for her, or he's noticing Dollface, who is standing right fucking here. Yeah, see, then Dollface pops out in an admittedly frightening scene because that mask is so neat, but where did she come from? Well, let's go back. We were already shown she's like a fucking ninja in those shadows, so it makes sense that she could have been just standing in this dark hallway and Kristen just didn't see her. So again, logically this all ties together a bit more so than people had noticed. After Dollface spooks Kristen some more, she steps over to the table and picks up the velvet ring box. This is a pretty good scene as she's holding it sort of tenderly and looking at it as if studying something she doesn't quite understand, all the while experiencing what could appear to be a level of envy and even some hints of emotion. And it was almost going to be a humanizing moment until she picks up a kitchen knife and a pretty tense sequence goes down, with, the whole her slowly approaching and dragging the knife across the table. It's revealed that James is still alive, and Kristen runs off to the bedroom to hide as the strangers have the place surrounded. She attempts to fight back, but it fails completely and brings us to our final iconic scene. The couple finds themselves tied up and we're delivered an awesome fucking moment. Okay, let me just get this out. This works so goddamn well. First, we're finally shown the strangers in broad daylight standing imposingly over the couple. The illusion of anything supernatural is just a memory at this point, but the symbolism is heavy here. The score during this moment is also amazing as low strings create a lurking, visceral sense of evil. We've got the three figures representing the perversion of the nuclear family, with the man in the mask being the father, the pinup girl as the mother, and Dollface being the child. The couple have been dressed back up in their proper wedding attire, Kristen's lavender dress representing femininity and elegance, and the black suit of James being a symbol of formality and tradition. This is juxtaposed by the strangers, who act as a mockery of this whole idea, with the two girls being dressed casually and the man in the mask wearing a seemingly vintage brown suit. Another nod to the 70s style the movie draws from. The color brown is also symbolic of warmth and a welcoming nature, friendliness, if you will. This, of course, is bastardized by the man in the mask's malice, and even mocked more so by the crudely drawn smile on his face. The scene is wonderfully paced as the two parties just kind of exchange stares at each other before Kristen asks why they're doing this. The childlike nature of Dollface is shown again here by her response in an almost completely innocent tone.
Because you were home.
An excellently crafted emotional scene follows, and with it comes a whole new level of depth. The two hold hands, seemingly for the last time, and it's revealed to James that Kristen is wearing the ring he got her. The nonverbal communication through the acting here is phenomenal. The couple have a moment of true passion in the face of evil, and the unresolved issue of their engagement is finally put to rest. Note, while this is happening, the man in the mask looks furious and almost in disbelief. Again, some wonderful nonverbal communication going on. Look at his eyes! Because for a moment their fear is gone, and in a tragic way, their love has triumphed, and there's a moment where they find peace and resign themselves to their fate. But it's all for naught! Because like all horror movies, we know this ain't gonna end well. But I love how this final scene is executed, no pun intended. See, the strangers remove their masks, and with it, any chance of survival the couple might have had. The anonymity is gone, and it creates a twisted sense of intimacy in that by revealing their faces, it means the couple now has to die. The worst part is that there's no catharsis for us, the audience, because we don't see their faces. Even if we did, it doesn't matter, because they're exactly what the title implies, strangers. It would never have even mattered if they wore masks or not. We don't know why any of this has happened, and there's literally no reason for it. It's pure, unbridled chaos, a senseless act, but you know what? They happen in real life, hence the inspiration. So then we get the church boys from the beginning encountering the strangers, and I'll admit it's a pretty great scene contrasting the two clearly different worlds they exist in, like I mentioned way earlier. Note how Dollface, again being the child, is the one who approaches them and asks for a pamphlet in her usual twisted innocence. We learn through just one line that this perceived innocence is actually somewhat sincere, because we hear Pinup say, "It'll be easier next time."
It'll be easier next time.
I want to note that some viewers have suspected that this implies that the events of the movie are the strangers' very first killing. but I don't actually think that's true. I think it more implies they, like, recruited Dollface or something along those lines. And that means it's her first time. But it is worth mentioning that there are 5 figures represented here, the boys and the strangers, and 5 during the murder with the strangers and the couple. Throughout a multitude of ancient and modern beliefs, the number 5 was, and still is, considered a sacred number, representing a divine balance. In this instance, with the boys, it represents the idea of God's absence. He is being represented visually, but the triumph of evil has already occurred. Could this also be a commentary on religion in general, with its odd premise of, despite your horrific acts, should you accept God into your life, you'll be forgiven? Well, maybe. Also, it's said that the Romans believed that the number 5 to be the number of marriage, yet another example of the symbolism fitting in perfectly with the earlier scene of the strangers and the couple, forming a fucked up wedding scene almost. We're then shown the same scene from the beginning with a few differences, and our ending stinger, showing that Kristen survived. Yay! So there we have it. I tried to consolidate most of the usual talking points into one form rather than the usual format of almost going through a checklist. If you haven't gathered yet, I really love this movie as it's a prime example of balancing some good scares with a relatively believable presentation, hence my illusion of the supernatural terminology. To summarize, the strangers appear in the beginning as almost supernatural entities that slowly over the course of the story are revealed to be more and more human until the end when this illusion finally breaks with the removing of their masks and the coming of the daylight. And even though they've removed their masks, we as the audience were unable to see them, so the nightmare truly hasn't ended. An element which has always been essential for the horror genre. While the movie isn't perfect, I think it's the closest thing we got, for now anyway. There might be something else out there that does it better in recent years, but based on some of the more popular movies I've listed, I have yet to see it. Like I said earlier, it just seems like more and more movies take the wrong messages away from this one. Here's an example. In 2016's Hush, the killer could have had something creepy going on. I mean, I thought his mask wasn't scary at all. But he removes it after like 2 seconds, removing any kind of this illusory effect. So now it's just some redneck dude who looks like that guy we all went to school with. Come on, you know this guy. And it even fails to get the idea of removing the anonymity wrong. Like, in The Strangers, it happens at the end, as we saw, but in this, it's like right in the first act. It's too forced and happens too soon in the story. Like, if you have something good, try to improve upon it, not appeal to popular trends. Usually those trends are just add more jump scares and call it good, because remember kids, if the movie made you jump, it's successful. Let's not take characters, story, and atmosphere or any of that into account. That's just for wannabe film critics. And no movie in recent times commits the sin of trying to appeal to the masses worse than the sequel, The Strangers Pray at Night. Spoilers, this movie fucking sucks. It's like, man, how do you fuck this up so bad? It literally ditches all of the subtlety of the first movie in order to try and recreate not just tropes, but cliches of the 80s slasher films. All the while, they play off key moments of the first movie like the hello written on the windows and the knife-dragging scene with Dollface. Yeah, I get that the hello on the window is supposed to be the MO of the group, but I didn't like it the first time around for reasons I stated, and I don't like it now either. And what the fuck is up with the retro horror angle? I don't necessarily have a problem with retro horror. One of my favorite movies is Beyond the Black Rainbow, but what the hell is this doing in The Strangers? If you were gonna be smart about it, you could make homages to the late 60s, early 70s, you know, like the first movie did, but no, this movie has to be like, look, see? This is music from the 80s. Isn't that cool? Don't you like the 80s? Don't you like Stranger Things? It's entirely incongruent with the characters. Like, why does the man in the mask just sit back and jam out to this stuff the whole movie? And furthermore, why the fuck did they make the truck into an entity in and of itself? I understand how this time they're in a wider open area and, like, you know, there's multiple places to hide, but the way they just cruise around in the truck the whole time like a fucking shark is just stupid. Uh-oh, they're revving the engine, so spooky, and it's made even less intimidating by the fucking 80s tunes blasting. Also, Christina Hendricks was in this movie for like 5 minutes and only played the role of a bitchy mother, and I was disappointed because I wanted to see her character evolve. But nope, we got the rehashed scene of Dollface dragging the knife and then she dies. How subversive. The whole damn movie just has this over-the-top action vibe to it, like the killers even seem more desperate this time around, and it feels like the psychotic killer aspect was turned up to 11 because they couldn't think of any good ideas this time around, I guess. Which I should note, this movie was still written by Brian Bertino, the guy who directed and wrote the first one, but he didn't direct the sequel here. I haven't seen any of his other films, so I can't comment on his skills outside the first Strangers, but I feel like he could have saved this one, maybe. Ugh. And then we get the unceremonious deaths of Dollface and Pinup, which is an insult to Pinup as a character. At least Dollface went out smiling, but they blatantly show her face, and it's not even tastefully done. She's just grinning like an idiot despite being mortally wounded, then shot by some angsty teen. And with Pinup, it's insulting because she completely loses all competency and stealth she had in the first one. She blatantly runs up to this kid and gets checked in the face, then stabbed by her own blade. Granted, this kid is the only character with any semblance of personality, but that's not saying much. And I almost had to stop watching the fucking movie when I heard Total Eclipse of the Heart come on. I almost had to turn the fucking movie off. Like, I'm human, so I love that song, but tell me that shit is any better than walking by the karaoke bar at night to hear drunk bros and Stacy singing, "Come on, Eileen." And I will admit, I visually like the pool scene, but that's about it. There's even an underwater struggle scene. Ooh. Anyone else hold their breath as long as they do in the movies to see if you can match it? I do that all the time. And look, despite my love for the first movie, I wanted to see the strangers get their comeuppance. That's what made the first movie so great. They didn't. There was no catharsis, no retribution taken against them for the pain and suffering they've caused. This movie's delivery on that was terribly executed because they couldn't decide on what they wanted to do. It's like, if they had all died quickly and with no real emphasis on the scene, that would be perfect karma because it would show their inflated sense of ego due to their evil acts, crushed instantly and without spectacle. The worst punishment for fictional psychopathic killers. But instead, the movie kind of tries that, then forgets all about it, and is like, whoa, look, the man in the mask is like an 80s horror villain. Yeah, sorry, we get the cliche lighter scene leading up to a pursuit from a flaming pickup truck. Okay, I'm sorry, the moment you got a flaming pickup truck chasing someone in a movie, I think it's safe to say that subtlety was something you weren't going for, or don't quite know the fucking definition of. I'll give credit where credit is due. If you wanted to take the movie in a different direction to help distinguish it from the first, fine. But you gotta make sure what you're doing is at least somewhat logically consistent with the source material. And what I mean by that is that in the first movie, they're basically ninjas who are eerily talented at psychologically torturing and stuff. But in this movie, they're bumbling idiots who seemingly forgot how to do any of that. I would honestly say that at best, this feels like a terrible fan fiction that someone pitched as a sequel, and because originality is scarce these days, it got picked up. Flaming pickup truck. Man in the Mask is one of those ridiculous moments where he should be dead, but isn't, then dies, but then comes back, but dies. Does that sound stupid? 'Cause it is. And as if any of this couldn't get any worse, the ending shows the main girl in the hospital next to her brother, and there's a knock on the door. I seriously cannot put into words how stupid this is. We're left to assume that the man in the mask comes back yet again, remember at this point, horrifically burned and probably suffering at least a moderate concussion whilst also losing copious amounts of blood. He shows up to a public place, a hospital, no doubt filled with tons of medical, security, and janitorial staff, and is gonna go kill this girl. Yeah, I wish I were fucking making this up. And before you give me the whole, well, that's a pretty common trope amongst slasher movies, yeah, well, it's fucking stupid, and that's why the genre was suffering. That's why in order to move forward, Scream had to do what it did and all that shit I said earlier, and yeah, that's why I made this video. All in all, I recommend The First Strangers highly, and if you've already seen it, definitely give it another watch and keep in mind what we've been talking about. You might see it a bit differently afterwards. Of course, if you also just don't agree with me, that's fine too. After all, this is just my opinion and it comes from my own experiences. Either way, let me know what you guys think in the comments. What are some of your favorite slasher movies? What are your thoughts on this movie? Do you like the second one? 'Cause you're fucking wrong if so!